The office was a place where words fought for air, each sentence competing for space and attention in the endless noise. Janice sat at her desk, the glow of her computer screen casting a pale light across her tired face. The hum of fluorescent lights above buzzed like an ongoing reminder of the mundanity of her life. The walls were a faded shade of beige, the kind that tried but failed to create any sense of warmth or comfort. It was the kind of office where you clocked in, did your work, and clocked out. But lately, Janice had been questioning her place in it all. "Janice, you're not listening." Karen's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and commanding. As always, Janice had been zoning out, something she did more often these days, but she wasn't truly absent. Her mind had been quietly working, running through the million things she would rather be doing than sitting in this endless meeting. Still, Karen's tones snapped her back into the present, and she forced her eyes to focus on the chaos unfolding in the conference room. "I'm trying to say that," Janice started, her voice soft, measured. She had learned the hard way that being too direct with Karen could lead to ridicule, so she always approached things gently, carefully, like walking on eggshells. But Karen didn't wait for her to finish. "Janice, you don't get it, do you?" Karen cut her off, the words coming out with a sharpness that made Janice's throat tighten. "We've already been over this. Just leave it to me." Karen tossed her hair over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the room for approval from the others. The others nodded, their attention already drifting back to Karen's presentation on the latest marketing strategy. It was as if Janice's presence in the room had been erased, nothing more than background noise to the real conversation. Janice let out a slow breath and looked down at her hands, the ones that had typed out countless emails and reports, the hands that had edited documents and helped organize meetings. Yet the same hands that seemed invisible in moments like this. The same hands that had ideas but never the platform to voice them. Her thoughts turned inward, and she wished she could disappear, sink into the shadows of the office and escape from the judgmental eyes of her colleagues. It wasn't that Janice didn't have something to say. It was that the world around her refused to listen. Karen had always been the loudest voice in the room, always the one who took center stage, her opinions dominating every conversation. Everyone else had learned to defer to her, to nod along to whatever she said, like she was the unspoken queen of the office. And Janice? Well, she was the one who got caught in the crossfire. Her voice lost, her ideas overlooked, and her worth constantly questioned. She could feel her frustration simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just Karen. It was everyone. From the marketing team to her own family, it felt like no one truly saw her. No one heard her, not even when she had something important to say. And the worst part was, she had started to believe them. She started to believe that her thoughts were irrelevant, that her voice didn't matter. How many times had she been shut down in meetings, or ignored when she offered a suggestion? Too many to count. Janice's stomach churned, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She hated this feeling, the feeling of being invisible, the feeling of being ignored. But what could she do about it? After all, she was just Janice, the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who never stirred the pot or demanded attention. And yet, she couldn't shake the thought that there was something more to her than just being the quiet worker bee. There had to be more. Her thoughts were interrupted as Karen's voice pierced through the fog of her mind once more. "Janice, did you hear me?" Karen asked, her tone sharp, an edge of irritation creeping into her voice. Janice blinked, suddenly aware that everyone was looking at her. She had spaced out again, a habit that had become too familiar. Sorry," she mumbled, feeling the heat rush to her face. I don't agree with that approach. I think we should consider a different angle." She felt her voice grow steadier, even though she knew Karen wasn't going to take her seriously. Karen rolled her eyes. "Yeah, whatever. Let's move on." She turned back to the whiteboard, and the room followed suit, quickly returning to Karen's scripted presentation. Janice slumped in her chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had said something. She had tried, but it hadn't mattered. It was as if she was speaking to a brick wall. The silence that followed was deafening, and Janice's mind wandered once again. But this time, It didn't wander to the office or to Karen, or even to the countless hours she had spent trying to fit in. This time, it wandered somewhere else. Somewhere she could finally speak without interruption. Her thoughts shifted to the podcast idea she had been mulling over for weeks. She had always been fascinated by podcasts, how they gave people a chance to speak their truths, to connect with others in ways that felt personal and real. It wasn't about shouting over someone else or fighting for airtime. It was about creating a space for your voice to be heard, for your ideas to resonate with an audience. She'd wanted to start her own podcast for years, but the fear of being ignored, of having her voice dismissed yet again, had always held her back. But now, sitting in this meeting, surrounded by the noise of other people's opinions, Janice felt a spark. What if she didn't have to be the one shouting to be heard? What if she didn't have to fight for a seat at the table? What if she could create her own platform, one where her voice wasn't just tolerated but valued? She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Without thinking, she opened the voice memo app and pressed record. The words came slowly at first, but as she spoke, she could feel her confidence building. I'm not here to be the loudest. I'm here to be heard. And I will be heard. The words sounded different when spoken into a microphone. They carried weight, they held meaning. This wasn't just about a meeting or Karen's incessant interruptions. This was about something bigger. This was about reclaiming her voice. Janice paused for a moment, the reality of what she was doing settling in. She was starting a podcast, not for anyone else but for herself. For the version of her that had always been drowned out. For the voice that had been ignored for too long. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As the meeting dragged on, Janice's mind raced with ideas. She didn't have it all figured out yet. She didn't know what topics she would cover or how she would grow her audience. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a passive participant in the world anymore. She was about to become an active creator, someone who had a platform for their own voice. A place where no one could drown her out. The clock ticked down, and the meeting finally came to an end. Janice grabbed her bag, her heart still racing from the realization of what she had just done. She wasn't going to wait for someone else to give her permission. She wasn't going to wait for the validation of others. She was going to create her own space in the world, one where her voice mattered, even if it started with just one person listening. The days that followed felt like a blur of motion, yet Janice could sense the subtle changes within her. It was as if something had shifted in her, deep down. Something she hadn't recognized before, but something she knew was there now. Her mind raced with possibilities. It was as if she'd been handed a ticket to a new world, one where she had control. She spent her evenings planning, researching, and slowly, steadily, bringing her podcast idea to life. It wasn't easy. The familiar routine of her job at the office was draining. Each day, Karen would take center stage, once again dominating conversations and meetings. Janice couldn't help but notice the smugness in her colleagues' tone every time she shut Janice down. But Janice had stopped caring. It didn't matter anymore. Every moment she spent at the office was a step closer to her true goal, a step closer to the new life she was building for herself. On her lunch breaks, Janice found herself at her favorite cafe, a cozy little spot a few blocks from her office. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the rich scent of baked goods that lined the counter. The cafe was her refuge, a quiet place where she could disconnect from the chaos of her daily life. There, she would sit by the window watching people walk by, lost in her thoughts, sketching ideas for her podcast. She'd always been a listener. She listened to her coworkers' idle chatter. She listened to the small talk of strangers in coffee shops. She listened to the hum of city life. But now, for the first time, she was ready to speak, ready to be the one who was heard. She found herself drawn to podcasts, not just as a listener, but as someone who could contribute to the conversation. The podcasts she had always loved, those focused on personal growth, career advice, overcoming obstacles, became her blueprint. She would talk about her own experiences, her own struggles, the times she had been overlooked or dismissed. She would speak to the quiet voices, the ones like hers, who had always been told they weren't enough. As she jotted down ideas, Janice reflected on the days she had spent shrinking into the background. She had always been the one who spoke softly, who hesitated before offering an opinion, the one who watched others take credit for ideas she had shared first. There were moments she wanted to scream, to shout, to make the world listen. But she had been taught to stay quiet, to keep her head down, to work hard and wait for recognition. That had never worked for her. The recognition never came. It was in the midst of these quiet realizations that Janice remembered something. A lesson her grandmother had always told her. The world doesn't give you a seat at the table. You have to build your own table. It was a simple statement, but it struck her with the force of truth. She had spent too long waiting for someone to give her a seat, and all the while, she had the power to build her own. And that's exactly what she intended to do. Her podcast began to take shape, slowly at first, then with more confidence as the days passed. She started recording her thoughts, sharing her stories of workplace struggles, the hurt of being ignored, and her determination to overcome it. She added her personal experiences, how she had grown up in a small town where voices like hers were silenced by those in power. The world, she realized, was full of people who had something to say, but too often, they were drowned out by louder voices. The technical side of things was a challenge. Janice was no expert when it came to microphones, audio editing, or hosting platforms. But she was determined, and that made all the difference. Each evening after work, she would sit in her small apartment, surrounded by piles of research, trying to make sense of all the technical details. It was frustrating at times. There were moments when the sound quality was off, when her voice didn't come through clearly enough, or when the editing software wouldn't cooperate. But Janice refused to quit. She had spent years listening to others take control of the narrative, and now it was her turn to take control of her own. Weeks passed, and she grew more comfortable with the process. Each recording felt like a small victory. The words she had kept bottled up for years began to flow freely. She had always been afraid of her own voice, but now her voice felt like power. And with every podcast episode, she could feel herself growing bolder. She was no longer the silent observer. She was the one shaping the story. Her first episode was nothing more than a simple introduction. Her voice shaky at first, but steady as she found her rhythm. She spoke about her life, the challenges she faced, and the obstacles she had overcome. She shared the story of how she had been overlooked in her job, how her ideas were dismissed by people who had more power, more influence, and louder voices. It wasn't a story of bitterness, but of resilience. She was telling her truth, and that truth was powerful. Once the episode was posted, Janice waited. She wasn't sure what to expect. She had no grand illusions of becoming an overnight success. But what she did know was this. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something meaningful. She had put herself out there, and whether anyone listened or not, it didn't matter. She had taken that first step, and that step meant everything. Days passed, and Janice found herself checking the stats on her podcast. The numbers weren't huge, but they were growing. Slowly, people were listening. A few comments came in from listeners, some of them strangers, others friends from her past. But all of them had something in common. They thanked her for sharing her story. They thanked her for speaking out, for saying the things they couldn't say themselves. Some of them even asked for advice on how to find their own voice. It was in these small moments that Janice realized something profound. Her story wasn't just hers. It was a story that resonated with so many others. She wasn't alone in her struggles. There were countless people, just like her, who had been silenced by louder voices, who had been told they weren't enough, who had been dismissed and overlooked. Her voice mattered, and she wasn't just talking for herself anymore. She was talking for all of them. The next week, Janice recorded her second episode. It was about overcoming the fear of failure, the fear that had held her back for so long, the fear that had kept her from speaking up in meetings or pursuing her dreams. She talked about how she had spent years working hard but never getting the recognition she deserved, and how she had let that fear keep her from stepping into her power. As she finished editing the episode and prepared to post it, Janice felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had no idea where this journey would take her, But she knew one thing. She was no longer afraid of her own voice. She had found her platform, her space, her own table, and no one could take that away from her. Janice sat at her desk, the light from her computer screen reflecting off her glasses as she stared at the growing numbers of listens on her podcast. It wasn't a huge number, but it was enough to give her hope. Enough to make her believe that this was something real, something worth investing in. The world hadn't come knocking yet, but there were signs. Small ones. In the emails, the messages, the comments she'd started receiving. People were listening. People were hearing her. She had gone from recording in her small apartment to researching how to improve the technical side of things. The sound quality, the editing, the flow, it all mattered. She was meticulous now, re-recording lines that didn't feel right, adjusting the pitch of her voice to make sure it conveyed the emotion she wanted. There was something satisfying about crafting the perfect episode. It wasn't just about telling her story anymore. It was about creating an experience for the listener, something they could connect with, something that would make them feel less alone. The podcast had become her therapy, her way of releasing the tension that had built up inside her for so long. Every episode, every word she spoke into the mic, felt like an exhale. She was no longer bottling things up. She was letting them out into the world, and it felt freeing. It was like she had unlocked a part of herself she didn't even know existed, a part that had been buried under years of silence. As the weeks went by, Janice's episodes gained more traction. She'd been consistent, posting weekly, and her voice began to spread. She'd started sharing her thoughts on self-worth, how she had been undervalued in her job and in life, and how she had come to understand that her value didn't depend on anyone else's recognition. She spoke about the loneliness she had felt in the workplace, the quiet desperation of wanting to be seen but never being acknowledged. But each time she spoke, it was with the knowledge that she had been there, and she had survived it. And if she could survive it, so could others. One morning, while sipping her coffee at the kitchen table, Janice received a message that made her heart skip a beat. It was from an old acquaintance, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. It read, "I just wanted to let you know how much your podcast means to me. I've been following your journey, and I can relate to everything you're saying. I've been in a similar situation at work, and listening to your episodes has given me the courage to speak up. I just wanted you to know you're making a difference." Janice sat back, her fingers still wrapped around her coffee mug, the warmth spreading through her. The message was simple, yet it carried a weight that made her chest tighten. For so long, she had thought her voice didn't matter. She had believed that if she wasn't loud enough, if she didn't make enough of a fuss, she would remain invisible. But this message, from someone she barely knew, told her that her words were reaching someone. They were making a difference. It was a small victory, but it was enough to fuel her passion for the next episode, the next story. Janice knew that this wasn't just about the numbers or the recognition, it was about the impact. It was about connecting with the people who felt just like she had felt. Overlooked, dismissed, silenced. She was giving them a voice, and in turn, she was finding her own. But even as her podcast gained momentum, Janice couldn't escape the lingering doubts that crept in during quiet moments. Was she really making a difference? Would people listen for long? Or was this just another passing phase? There were moments when the old fears resurfaced, the fear of failure, of being laughed at, of putting herself out there only to be ignored again. But she pushed those thoughts away, reminding herself that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the people who had written to her, the ones who had reached out to say they were going through the same struggles. It was about them, and if she could help even one person feel less alone, less invisible, then it was worth it. Janice decided to take a risk. She reached out to an old friend from her college days, someone who had started a successful YouTube channel and built a following online. Her name was Rachel, and she was a powerhouse, a woman who had built an empire from the ground up, creating content around personal growth and empowerment. Janice had always admired Rachel's confidence, the way she owned every space she entered. She had always wished she could be more like Rachel, someone who wasn't afraid to take up space, to speak up, to be heard. Janice nervously typed out a message asking if Rachel would be willing to collaborate on an episode of her podcast. It felt bold, audacious even, but she knew it was time to step outside her comfort zone. She needed to learn from someone who had already walked the path she was beginning to carve for herself. She hit send and waited, heart pounding in her chest. The next day, she got a reply. "I'd love to. I've been following your podcast and I think what you're doing is incredible. Let's make it happen." Janice couldn't believe it. Rachel had her game and bring something new to her audience. It was a moment of validation, a moment that told her she was on the right path. They scheduled the recording for the following week. The nerves that had once paralyzed Janice now fueled her excitement. She was ready. This collaboration was going to be the next step in her journey, the next chapter in her transformation. When the day of the recording arrived, Janice set up her microphone, making sure everything was in place. She had spent hours preparing, outlining the conversation, thinking about the questions she wanted to ask Rachel, the topics they would cover. She knew this was her chance to learn from someone who had built a platform from scratch, and she was going to make the most of it. As the recording began, Janice felt a sense of calm wash over her. Rachel's energy was contagious, her enthusiasm infectious. The conversation flowed easily, both women sharing their experiences, their struggles, and the lessons they had learned along the way. It wasn't just an interview. It was a conversation between two women who had faced obstacles and overcome them. It was a conversation about finding your voice, about standing up for yourself, and about the power of community. As the episode wrapped up, Rachel looked at Janice with a smile. "You're doing something amazing here, Janice. Don't ever doubt that." Janice felt a swell of gratitude. She had spent so much of her life doubting herself, wondering if she was worthy of success, wondering if anyone would ever listen. But in that moment, with Rachel's words ringing in her ears, Janice knew something had changed. She had found her place in the world. She had found her voice, and it was finally being heard. Janice's phone buzzed once again, interrupting her quiet evening. She had been sitting in the corner of her apartment, the dim light of her desk lamp casting long shadows as she made final edits to her latest podcast episode. She had developed a small ritual, a quiet moment before she posted the new episode, where she took a deep breath and allowed herself to be present in the work she was doing. Her world had shifted, and the way she looked at her life now was different. She wasn't just a worker, a cog in the machine anymore. She was a creator. She was an influencer. Her heart fluttered as she glanced at the notification. An email from an organization she had applied to months ago. She hesitated for a second before clicking it open. "Dear Janice," it began, "we are pleased to inform you that your podcast has been selected for inclusion in our directory of emerging creators. Your focus on personal growth and overcoming professional obstacles resonates with our values, and we believe your voice will make a difference in the lives of our community." Janice read the email again, just to make sure her eyes weren't deceiving her. Selected for inclusion, she felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. For so long, she had been told that she wasn't enough, that her quietness made her invisible. But now, here she was, with an opportunity to be part of something bigger than herself. She immediately responded, sending her thanks and confirming her excitement. As soon as the email was sent, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers trembling slightly. It felt surreal, like all the little moments of doubt she had experienced along the way had led to this. But the real test was coming. Would she keep going? Would she continue to face the doubts, the obstacles, the voices telling her she wasn't worthy? As she closed her laptop, her mind wandered back to the office, to the place where her journey had begun. She couldn't help but think about Karen, the loud, confident colleague who had always overshadowed her. She remembered the first time Karen had cut her off in a meeting, dismissing her suggestion without a second thought. At the time, Janice had been crushed. It had felt like the end of the road, like her ideas didn't matter, like she didn't matter. But now, the thought of Karen no longer stung. Karen's voice no longer controlled the space in Janice's world. It was as if Janice had stepped out of the shadows, and now, she was claiming the spotlight on her own terms. She had become her own version of successful in a way that mattered to her. Days passed and Janice's podcast grew. More people began to listen, to engage with her episodes. She didn't expect overnight fame or massive success, but she did begin to feel the pulse of something real and sustaining beneath the surface. People were reaching out to her, sharing their own stories, telling her how her words had inspired them. She was becoming part of a community, one that valued authenticity and quiet strength. It was the kind of community she had longed for, the one that allowed space for voices like hers. One evening, after a long day of work at the office, Janice received a phone call. The number was unfamiliar, but something in her gut told her it was important. She picked it up. "Hello. Hi, Janice. This is Mara from the Podcast Network. We've been following your podcast, and we love what you're doing. We think your voice could reach even more people, and we'd like to discuss a potential collaboration." Janice's pulse quickened. A collaboration? This was bigger than she could have imagined. She had dreamed of opportunities like this, but to be honest, it felt almost too good to be true. Was she ready for it? Could she handle the pressure of a bigger platform, more exposure? Mara continued, her voice warm and excited. "We'd love to help you grow your podcast, connect you with some sponsors, and get you the recognition you deserve. We believe in your story, and we think there's a huge audience out there who would benefit from hearing it." Janice felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had worked so hard for this moment. Countless hours spent editing, recording, sharing her voice, and finally, it was paying off. This was the validation she had never received in the office, the recognition she had sought but never found. I don't know what to say. Thank you so much," Janice stammered. "This is all so overwhelming." Mara chuckled. "Take your time. We're excited to work with you, Janice. We'll set up a meeting to discuss next steps. You've got something special here." The call ended, and Janice sat there for a moment, holding her phone tightly in her hands. She had been given a chance. A real chance. The kind of opportunity she had dreamed about for years, but never thought would come. And now it was in her hands. That night, Janice walked through her apartment as if she were in a dream. She felt a rush of energy that came from deep within her. A feeling of triumph, of achievement. She had stepped into her own power, and no one could take that away from her. No longer would she be the one sitting in the back, waiting for her turn. She was the one creating the opportunities now. The next few days were a whirlwind. Janice found herself in meetings, calls, and planning sessions with people who believed in her podcast. She learned about sponsorships, partnerships, and marketing strategies. The world she had once considered out of reach was now within her grasp. She wasn't just recording episodes anymore. She was building a brand, a platform, and a movement. She was building the table she had once been told she could never sit at. Still, as the opportunities expanded, so did the pressure. Janice found herself questioning whether she could keep up with the demands of her growing podcast career while still working her day job. The sleepless nights, the constant juggling of work and passion projects. It was exhausting, but with every new step, she grew more confident in her ability to manage it all. She had built this from the ground up, and she wasn't about to let it crumble. In one of her episodes, Janice spoke candidly about the struggle. She talked about the balance between pursuing a passion and handling responsibilities. How difficult it was to give yourself permission to dream big when life seemed to keep getting in the way. But, she said, if you don't make room for your dreams, you'll find that they'll get swallowed up by the everyday grind. And one day, you'll wake up and wonder where the time went. As she recorded this particular episode, Janice realized just how far she had come. She had started this podcast as an act of self-expression, a way to find her voice in a world that had constantly tried to silence her. But now it was more than that. It was a platform for others to find their voices too. It was a community of people who shared the same struggles, the same dreams. She didn't know where this path would take her, but she knew one thing. It would be her path. She would continue to speak up, to share her story, and to give others the platform to share theirs. She had taken control of her own narrative, and no one could take that away. Janice's world had completely shifted. What had once been a quiet, solitary venture, a podcast created in the confines of her apartment, had blossomed into something bigger than she could have ever imagined. The calls and emails had continued to pour in, each one offering more opportunities, more collaborations. She had transitioned from just a creator to an influencer, someone with a voice that was reaching more people than she had ever thought possible. Yet, with every new success, a fresh wave of pressure came crashing in. She had expected it. She had always known that success brought new challenges, but nothing had prepared her for how overwhelming it would feel to balance everything. The podcast was demanding more of her time, more of her attention. It wasn't just the work. It was the emotional labor that came with it. There were days when she wondered if she was ready for the path she had chosen. But deep down, she knew there was no turning back now. She had already taken the leap. One Friday evening, as Janice sat in her favorite corner of the cafe, sipping on a steaming cup of chamomile tea, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. It was her small ritual, to visit the cafe after a week's work, to sit quietly and absorb the peace. The bustle of the office, the constant demands, the hustle. It all faded away here. This was her time to just be, to let her thoughts wander. But tonight was different. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was at a crossroads. The opportunities that had come her way were exciting, yes, but they were also overwhelming. As her podcast grew, so did the expectations. She'd been asked to appear on multiple shows, partner with brands, host live events, and even attend conferences. Her email inbox was flooded daily with requests and offers. It was a dream, but it also felt like a weight on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed, pulling her back to reality. It was an email from her boss at the office. She hesitated before opening it. She had been hoping for a change for so long, but now that the opportunity seemed within reach, she wasn't sure if she was ready to make the jump. She knew that if she focused solely on the podcast, her job would have to take a back seat, and the decision wasn't an easy one. She clicked on the email. "Janice, I've been reviewing your recent work, and I have some exciting news. We'd like to offer you a promotion, with more responsibilities and a significant salary increase. This is a great opportunity, and we believe you're ready for the next step." The words hung in the air, and Janice felt her heart skip a beat. Promotion. This was the recognition she had been waiting for at the office. It was the validation that all the long hours, all the late nights, had been worth it. But as she read the email again, something felt off. This was the moment she had wanted for so long. But now that it was in front of her, it didn't feel as fulfilling as she had imagined. She had spent years working towards this moment, climbing the corporate ladder, proving herself. Yet here she was, faced with a choice that felt too simple, too expected. She took a deep breath and set the phone down, staring out the cafe window. The lights from the passing cars illuminated the sidewalk, casting long shadows that stretched toward her. She had worked hard for this job, for the recognition, for the security it offered. But now her heart wasn't in it. Her heart was with the podcast, with her voice, with her mission to connect with people who had once felt invisible like her. The promotion at the office would have been a victory, one that many would have envied. But the truth was, it didn't excite her anymore. Her podcast, her platform, that was where her passion was now. That was where she felt alive. She had a chance to create something real, something that wasn't tied to a paycheck or a company's expectations. The decision was clear. That night, Janice made her choice. She composed a polite but firm response to her boss, thanking him for the opportunity but declining the promotion. She explained that her personal and professional goals had shifted, and she wanted to focus fully on her podcast and the opportunities it was presenting. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but it was the right one. The next morning, she woke up with a sense of clarity. It was like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The decision to step away from her corporate career wasn't an easy one, but it was the right one for her. She had chosen herself. She had chosen her voice. And for the first time in a long time, she felt in control of her life. As she walked to the cafe that morning, she felt a sense of excitement building inside her. The path ahead was unknown, but it was hers to carve. She didn't need the corporate world to validate her worth anymore. She had already proven that she could make a difference, that her voice mattered. That afternoon, Janice recorded an episode of her podcast that felt different from all the others. She spoke about the power of letting go, the power of choosing your own path, even when it meant walking away from something familiar and safe. She talked about the importance of following your passion, of not letting fear dictate your choices. "I used to be afraid," she said into the microphone. "Afraid that if I left behind the job, the salary, the security, I'd be nothing. I thought I needed those things to be successful. But I've realized that success isn't about titles or paychecks. It's about living your truth. It's about finding your voice and using it. It's about showing up for yourself, even when the world tells you to play it safe. You don't need permission to chase your dreams. You don't need validation from anyone. You just need to believe that you're worth it." As Janice finished recording, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was the beginning of something new. She wasn't sure where it would take her, but she knew she was ready. She had spent so many years living for others, living for the approval of her boss, her colleagues, and her family. But now she was living for herself. She had built something from the ground up, and it was time to nurture it, to watch it grow. The next few weeks were filled with more interviews, more collaborations, and more growth. Janice continued to expand her reach, growing her audience and connecting with more people who needed to hear her message. She even received invitations to speak at conferences, to share her story with others who were going through similar struggles. But Janice never lost sight of the core of her podcast, the reason she started in the first place. She was there for the quiet voices, the ones who had been told they didn't matter. She was there to give people the platform to speak their truths, to stand up for themselves, and to own their worth. She was giving them the space she had once longed for. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Janice sat in front of her computer, reading through messages from her listeners. She had always thought that her story was just hers, that her struggles, her pain, her triumphs were hers alone to bear. But as she read the messages, she realized something profound. Her story wasn't just hers. It was everyone's. She was telling the stories of the people who had been overlooked, dismissed, and silenced. She was giving them the voice they had been denied. Janice leaned back in her chair, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her lips. She had found her purpose. She had found her voice. And nothing, not a promotion, not the corporate world, could take that away from her. The weeks following Janice's decision to leave her corporate job were a whirlwind. She had taken the leap, and now she was fully immersed in the world she had once only dreamed of. A world where her voice mattered, where she was no longer invisible. But as exciting as it was also overwhelming. Janice quickly learned that being a full-time creator was not as glamorous as she had once imagined. The freedom to set her own schedule came with the responsibility of making every decision herself. There were moments when she doubted if she was cut out for this new life. The pressure to keep producing content, to maintain a growing audience, to constantly deliver something new. Sometimes it felt suffocating. But she kept going. Her podcast continued to grow, its episodes resonating with people in ways she had never imagined. She began to receive messages from listeners telling her how much her words had inspired them, how they had found comfort in her vulnerability, in her honesty. The realization that she was making a real impact in the lives of others filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what she had been searching for. This was her calling. Yet, there were still moments of self-doubt. Janice had always been her own worst critic, and now, with the stakes higher than ever, she found herself questioning whether she was doing enough. Was she pushing herself too hard? Was she spreading herself too thin? Her mornings were filled with writing scripts, editing episodes, and brainstorming new ideas. Her evenings were spent promoting her podcast on social media, networking with potential sponsors, and responding to messages from fans. She had no team behind her. Everything was on her shoulders. It was exhausting. One particularly difficult day, Janice sat in her apartment, scrolling through social media, her mind overwhelmed by the constant pressure. Everywhere she looked, there were influencers posting flawless pictures, brand partnerships, new sponsorships, and flawless engagement numbers. It felt like everyone around her was succeeding effortlessly. And there she was, still figuring it out, still wondering if she was enough. She had come so far from the days when her ideas were ignored at work, when her voice was drowned out by others. But now, in the world of content creation, it felt like the pressure to be perfect, to have it all together, was just as heavy. And as much as she told herself that she didn't need to compare her journey to others, it was hard not to feel like she was falling behind. That evening, she sat down at her desk to record her next episode, but the words didn't come easily. Her mind was clouded, and for the first time in a while she couldn't focus. She had always prided herself on her resilience, but tonight, her confidence felt fragile. She wanted to be real with her listeners. She wanted to tell them the truth about the struggles she was facing, but fear crept in. What if they thought she wasn't strong enough? What if they saw her self-doubt and questioned her ability to lead? Janice stared at her microphone for what felt like hours. The silent traffic outside her window. Her heart was racing, her palms sweaty. She had been afraid of this moment, afraid of the vulnerability that came with sharing not just the triumphs, but also the failures. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Janice hit record. "I'm struggling," she said softly into the microphone, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't always have it all together. I thought that when I left my corporate job and started this podcast, everything would just fall into place. But it hasn't. There are days when I feel like I'm drowning in all the things I have to do. There are days when I feel like I'm not enough. And it's hard. It's hard to admit that, because I've built this platform on strength, on overcoming obstacles. But the truth is, I don't always have the answers. I don't always know what I'm doing. And that's okay." The words felt heavy, but they were also freeing. Janice paused, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was speaking her truth. She wasn't trying to be perfect or put on a facade of having it all together. She was being real, and that was enough. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "I want you to know that you're not alone in your struggles. It's okay to not have everything figured out. It's okay to not have all the answers. What matters is that you keep showing up, that you keep going, even when it feels hard. You are enough just as you are. And I'm enough too." As Janice finished recording, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had shared the truth, her truth, and it felt empowering. She wasn't just telling her audience what they wanted to hear. She was giving them a piece of herself. She was showing them that it was okay to not be perfect, that they didn't have to have it all figured out. When Janice posted the episode, she was nervous. Would people respond to her honesty? Would they still see her as a credible source of inspiration? She knew there was always a risk in being vulnerable, but she also knew that it was the only way forward. The response she received was overwhelming. People thanked her for being honest, for showing them that it was okay to not have it all together. They shared their own struggles, their own fears, and how they had been inspired by Janice's authenticity. For the first time in weeks, Janice felt a sense of peace. She wasn't alone in this. She had created something real, something that resonated with others on a deep human level. The next few weeks brought more opportunities, sponsorships, brand partnerships, invitations to speak at conferences. But Janice knew that the key to her success wasn't in the numbers, the sponsorships, or the brand deals. It was in the connections she had made, the lives she had touched, and the authenticity she brought to every episode. She had come a long way from the woman who had been ignored in meetings, from the woman who had thought her voice didn't matter. Now, Janice was a force to be reckoned with. She was building a community, a platform, a movement, and the best part was, she was doing it on her own terms. But even as she embraced her success, Janice knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be days when the doubts crept in again, when the pressure felt too heavy to bear. But she had learned something invaluable over the past few months. That it was okay to not have all the answers, that it was okay to struggle, and that as long as she stayed true to herself, she could overcome anything. Janice took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair. Her eyes closed for a moment as she reflected on how far she had come. She had found her voice, and she had built something real. And as she continued to share her story with the world, she knew that her journey was just beginning. Janice sat by the window, staring out at the city that had become both her source of inspiration and her battleground. The skyline gleamed with the promise of success, But she knew firsthand that success wasn't as glamorous as it appeared from a distance. It had been months since she had left her corporate job, and yet the weight of her decisions still felt present in the quiet moments of reflection. She had made the right choice. She knew that in her heart. Leaving her steady job to pursue her podcast had been the boldest move of her life, and it was paying off. Her audience had grown exponentially, the partnerships had rolled in, and people were recognizing her name. But as her platform grew, so did the pressure. The constant need to produce content, to keep up with expectations, to stay relevant. It was becoming a burden she hadn't anticipated. Lately, Janice had been feeling the weight of isolation more than ever. As her podcast took off, she found herself spending more time alone. The initial thrill of success had worn off, leaving behind the reality of working solo. She had no team, no one to bounce ideas off of. There was no one to celebrate the small victories with or share the defeats. For someone who had always relied on others for validation, this was a lonely road to walk. Even her relationships with family and friends had started to change. They didn't understand what it was like to be a creator, to be constantly battling the doubts that came with putting yourself out into the world. They saw the success, the brand deals, the recognition, but they didn't see the late nights, the self-doubt, the constant push to be better. They didn't understand that success didn't always feel like victory. Sometimes, it felt like pressure, like a never-ending chase. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel, her former college friend who had become a trusted collaborator on her podcast. "Hey Janice, hope you're doing well. I've been thinking about your last episode. The vulnerability you shared really resonated with me. I've been struggling with similar feelings of isolation in my own work. How are you holding up?" Janice smiled softly as she read Rachel's message. Rachel was one of the few people who truly understood the emotional side of creating. They had shared similar struggles in the past, feeling like outsiders, feeling like their voices weren't heard. Rachel was a successful content creator in her own right, but Janice knew that even she had moments of self-doubt, moments when the weight of expectations threatened to crush her. Janice replied quickly, typing out the truth in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. "Honestly, I'm struggling. I thought I'd feel more fulfilled now that things are growing, but sometimes it feels like more of a burden. I'm spending so much time working, and I'm not sure I have anyone to talk to about it. It's like I've built this empire, but I'm all alone in it." As she hit send, Janice felt a wave of relief. For the first time in days, she had let someone in. She wasn't hiding behind the facade of everything is fine anymore. She had acknowledged her feelings, her struggles, and that felt like progress. Rachel responded quickly, "I get it. I've been feeling the same way lately. It's the quiet parts of success no one talks about. The loneliness, the pressure to keep going, the fear of burning out. I think we need to talk about this more. People see the highlights, but they don't see the behind-the-scenes exhaustion." Janice sat back, letting Rachel's words sink in. She wasn't alone in this after all. The isolation she felt was something shared by so many creators, so many people who had built something from scratch only to find that the success they had longed for didn't necessarily bring happiness. But how could she reconcile the fulfillment of her work with the cost it was taking on her mental and emotional health? The following week, Janice attended an industry conference, an event she had been invited to speak at. It was an incredible honor, one that many of her peers would envy. She was finally getting the recognition she had always wanted. But as she prepared her speech, she felt the familiar knot in her stomach. She had spoken in front of audiences before, but this was different. This was a chance to show the world the real Janice, her raw, unfiltered self. Standing backstage before her speech, Janice felt the weight of it all. She had spent years feeling invisible, and now here she was, about to take the stage in front of a room full of people who saw her as an expert, someone to listen to. But was she ready to be that person? Was she ready to carry the mantle of success without letting it crush her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of applause from the audience, signaling that it was her turn. She took a deep breath and walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment. The room was filled with faces, some familiar, others strangers. All eyes were on her, As she stepped up to the microphone, Janice could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She looked out over the crowd and began to speak, her voice steady but her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her words calm and measured. "I want to share with you my journey, not just the successes, but the struggles, the moments of self-doubt, the isolation, the fear of never being enough. Because I think it's important that we, as creators, acknowledge the parts of this journey that we don't often talk about." Janice continued, speaking candidly about the emotional toll of success, about the loneliness that sometimes accompanied it, and about how she had learned to accept imperfection. She shared her struggles with self-worth, her fear of being misunderstood, and her desire to help others who felt the same way. As she spoke, she noticed the nods in the audience, the looks of recognition on their faces. She wasn't the only one who felt this way. She wasn't the only one who had been struggling in silence. By the time she finished her speech, the room was silent for a moment. Then, the applause began. Louder this time, more genuine. It wasn't the applause for her accomplishments, for her brand, or for her podcast. It was the applause for her vulnerability, for her honesty. Janice left the stage feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She had spoken her truth, and the world had responded. She had finally allowed herself to be vulnerable, to acknowledge that success wasn't just about the external achievements. It was about how you felt along the way. And in that moment, Janice realized something profound. Vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was what made her human. Back at her hotel later that night, Janice sat on the edge of her bed, her mind buzzing with the events of the day. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. She wasn't alone in her struggles. She didn't have to carry the weight of success by herself. There was a community out there. People who understood her, who shared her experiences, and who were ready to walk this journey with her. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Rachel. "I'm so proud of you. I saw your speech today. You were amazing. And thank you for sharing the real stuff. Your truth. It's a rare thing, and it's what makes you stand out. Keep speaking your truth, Janice. You're doing incredible things." Janice smiled, her heart full. This was what she had been waiting for. Not the accolades or the brand deals or the recognition. It was the connection, the ability to reach others and show them that they weren't alone. It was about giving people permission to be themselves, to embrace their flaws, to admit that they didn't have all the answers. Janice knew now that success wasn't about perfection. It was about growth. It was about the messy, complicated, beautiful journey of becoming who you were always meant to be. The days after her speech at the conference had passed in a blur, but Janice couldn't shake the feeling of profound change that lingered. It wasn't just the applause or the positive feedback, though those things were rewarding in their own way. What had truly impacted her was the connection she had felt with the audience. When she had shared her story, when she had allowed herself to be vulnerable, she had seen the faces in the crowd light up with recognition. She wasn't alone in this. And she wasn't just telling her own story. She was telling the stories of everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unimportant. That night, as she sat in her hotel room, she reflected on how far she had come. There was still so much to accomplish, so many hurdles left to jump. But for the first time in a long while, Janice felt a sense of peace. She wasn't rushing toward something. She was exactly where she needed to be. Her podcast was continuing to thrive. She had recently signed a deal with a major podcast network, a partnership that would allow her to expand her reach and bring on new guests who could add even more depth to her episodes. She was getting emails from listeners every day, telling her how much her words had helped them, how her vulnerability had made them feel seen. She was changing lives, and she wasn't doing it by being perfect. She was doing it by being real. But success had a way of pulling you in different directions, and the pressure to keep up was beginning to weigh heavily on her. There was a part of Janice that still struggled with the need to be successful in the traditional sense. The email inboxes, the brand deals, the sponsorships, they all came with their own expectations. Was she still speaking from the heart? Was she still keeping her authenticity? Or was she now chasing the metrics, the likes, the follower counts? She thought back to a conversation she had had with Rachel just a few weeks ago. Rachel had reminded her that she didn't have to follow anyone else's path. She didn't have to do things the way others did. "Your story is powerful, Janice," Rachel had said. "You're building something real. Don't get lost in the noise of everyone else. Stay true to why you started." It was sound advice. And yet, as she scrolled through her social media feed that evening, comparing her numbers to others, Janice couldn't help but feel the pressure creeping in. The influencer world was built on numbers, followers, engagement, collaborations. And in this space, those numbers could feel like they were everything. Janice closed her laptop and sighed, rubbing her temples. She was so tired. Tired of trying to measure up. Tired of feeling like the next big thing was always just out of reach. She longed for the simplicity of the days when she had started her podcast. When it was just her microphone and her thoughts. Back then, her purpose had been clear. But now it was clouded by the pressure to grow, to scale, to become more. The phone rang, and Janice snapped out of her thoughts. It was her mom calling from home. "Hey, sweetie, how's everything going?" her mom asked, her voice warm, filled with care. Janice smiled as she heard the familiar sound of her mother's voice. No matter what was happening in her world, her mom always made it feel like everything would be okay. "I'm good, Mom. Just thinking a lot," Janice replied, settling back into the couch. "Things are going well with the podcast, but I've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately, like I'm trying to keep up with everyone else." Her mom's voice softened. "Sweetheart, you're doing amazing. I'm so proud of you. You've worked so hard for everything you've achieved. But don't lose yourself in it. Remember why you started in the first place. You have a gift. You're sharing your voice with the world. That's the important part." Janice closed her eyes, letting her mom's words sink in. It was so easy to get lost in the noise, to get caught up in the numbers and the external validation. But at the heart of it all, her purpose had always been about connection, about helping others find their voice. She wasn't just creating content. She was telling a story that needed to be heard, her story, and the stories of so many others who had felt invisible. "I know, Mom," Janice said, a sense of calm washing over her. "I just need to remember that. I'm not in this for the fame or the money. I'm in this because I want to help people. I want them to feel like they matter." Her mom chuckled softly. "Exactly, and you already are." After the call, Janice felt a renewed sense of clarity. She was still on the right path. She didn't need to compare herself to others, didn't need to chase the same goals that everyone else was chasing. She had created something that was uniquely hers, and that was enough. Over the next few days, Janice made a conscious effort to step away from the constant cycle of comparison. She stopped looking at the analytics, the follower counts, and the brand partnerships. Instead, she focused on what really mattered, the stories she was telling, the people she was connecting with, and the impact she was having on her audience. She decided to take a break from the usual content creation grind and do something different. A listener Q&A episode. She had been receiving messages from her audience, many of them sharing their own stories and asking for advice on how to find their voice in a world that often overlooked them. It was time to give her listeners the spotlight, to hear their voices and give them a platform. As Janice prepared for the episode, she felt a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in a while. This wasn't about her. This was about the people who had supported her, the people who had been following her journey. It was a reminder of why she started in the first place, to create a space for people to share their truths. The Q&A episode was a huge success. Her listeners shared deeply personal stories, asking for guidance on everything from career struggles to relationships to self-worth. Janice listened to each question carefully, responding with honesty, empathy, and the same vulnerability that had made her podcast so relatable in the first place. The episode ended up being one of her most popular, with hundreds of listeners reaching out to thank her for creating a space where they could share their experiences. For the first time in a while, Janice felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not from the numbers, but from the connections she had made. She realized then that her true success didn't lie in how many people followed her or how much money she was making. It lay in the impact she was having. It lay in the stories she was helping to tell, the voices she was amplifying, and the community she was building. Janice didn't need to be the loudest or the most popular. She just needed to keep showing up, keep sharing her truth, and keep creating a space for others to do the same. As the days turned into weeks, Janice continued to grow in her role as a creator, but more importantly, she grew in her understanding of what it meant to be successful. Success, she realized, was not about reaching the top of the ladder. It was about staying true to who you were and using your platform to uplift others along the way. She had come a long way from the woman who had once been invisible in the office, the woman who had been told she wasn't enough. She was no longer the quiet observer. She was a creator, a leader, and a force for change. And that, she knew, was the true definition of success. The months that followed were a delicate balance between momentum and introspection. Janice had become a known name in the podcasting world. Her episodes were now being downloaded thousands of times. She had brand deals lining up, and she had a loyal following who hung on every word she shared. But beneath the surface of outward success, something inside Janice was quietly shifting. The louder her platform, when she felt on top of the world, when every new listener, every new message from a fan, filled her with pride and purpose. But there were other moments, quieter ones, when the weight of expectations crushed her. It wasn't the pressure of the audience. It was the pressure she had put on herself. The podcast, which had begun as an honest outlet for her voice, had become a machine. A machine she had to feed constantly with new episodes, new content, new ideas. And while it had given her a platform, it had also taken something from her. The realization came on a late Sunday evening when Janice sat at her desk, staring at her laptop. The latest episode was supposed to be finished, ready to be posted first thing Monday morning. But as she listened to the recording again, something felt off. The words she had spoken felt empty. The passion that had once fueled her podcast had dimmed. She wasn't speaking from the heart anymore. She was just going through the motions. She paused the recording and leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. She didn't know what had changed. She had been so focused on growing, on keeping up with the pace of the industry, that somewhere along the way, she had lost the connection she once had with her audience. It wasn't the fault of her listeners or her sponsors. It was her own disconnection from her core. Janice closed her laptop and stood up, pacing around her apartment. She had been running on autopilot for so long. She had built this platform out of a need for validation, but now it felt like it was controlling her, not the other way around. She had been afraid of losing everything, her audience, her sponsors, her place in the world. But now, in the stillness of the evening, she realized that what she had feared losing was actually the very thing she had been neglecting. Herself. It was time for a change. The next morning, Janice woke up with a sense of clarity that had been absent for months. She knew what she had to do, but it wasn't going to be easy. She had to reclaim her authenticity, not just for herself, but for her audience. They had followed her because of the raw, vulnerable truths she had shared, not because of the polished, scripted content she had been churning out. She had to stop treating her podcast like a business and start treating it like a passion project again. It was time to return to the heart of why she had started in the first place. She took a deep breath and opened her laptop. The email inbox was flooded with messages, sponsorships, collaboration offers, requests for interviews. Normally, she would have responded immediately, but today was different. She spent the morning deleting the emails that no longer felt aligned with her values, unsubscribing from the newsletters that had been cluttering her inbox, and rethinking the direction she wanted her platform to go. Janice knew that her audience wasn't just there for her success stories. They were there because they saw themselves in her. They saw her struggles, her triumphs, and most importantly, they saw her humanity. She had shared her vulnerability with them, and it was time to do that again, not just in her podcast, but in her life. She hit record on her microphone that afternoon, her voice steady as she spoke directly to her listeners. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she began, her voice warm but real. "And I think I owe you all an apology. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I started this podcast. I got so caught up in trying to keep up with the world around me, trying to chase numbers, trying to get the next brand deal, that I forgot the most important thing, why I started this in the first place. To share my truth, to connect with people who felt just like me, to build a community where we could all be vulnerable together. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. There was no script, no planned speech. Just her truth, spoken raw into the microphone. I've been afraid of disappointing you all. Afraid that if I'm not constantly pushing forward, I'll lose everything I've built. But I'm realizing now that pushing forward isn't the goal. Staying true to myself, staying connected to what matters, that's what I've lost. And that's what I want to get back. For the next hour, Janice poured her heart into the podcast. She spoke about the pressures of success, the fear of failure, the loneliness of being a creator. She spoke about the doubts she had battled, the moments when she wondered if she was truly making an impact. She talked about the pain of putting so much of herself out into the world, and the relief she felt in finally admitting that she wasn't okay. And as she spoke, Janice realized something profound. This episode wasn't just for her listeners. It was for her. She needed to hear herself say those words. She needed to reconnect with the very thing that had made her start this journey. Vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was her strength. It was what had allowed her to connect with her audience in the first place, and it was what she had to embrace again. When the episode was finished, Janice sat back in her chair, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't felt in months. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't hiding behind the polished facade of success. She was being real, being herself, and that was enough. The episode went live later that day, and the response was immediate. Comments flooded in from listeners who had been waiting for her to share her truth. They thanked her for being open, for showing them that it was okay to not be perfect. They shared their own stories of struggle, of fear, and of resilience. Janice had always known that her podcast had the power to connect people, but now she realized how deeply it had impacted them. She wasn't alone in her journey, and neither were they. That evening, as she read through the messages from her listeners, Janice realized that she had found something far more valuable than the external success she had once chased. She had found a community, one that wasn't built on numbers or brand deals, but on shared experiences and mutual understanding. It was a place where people could be their authentic selves, where they could talk about their struggles without fear of judgment. It was a place where Janice could continue to speak her truth, and in doing so, inspire others to do the same. The next day, Janice made a decision. She was going to slow down. She was going to take her time and focus on the things that truly mattered. The podcast would still be a priority, but it would no longer be about chasing success. It would be about building something real, something meaningful. She wasn't going to let the pressure of the industry dictate her worth. She was going to follow her own path, one that was grounded in authenticity and connection. As she closed her laptop that night, Janice felt a deep sense of peace. The world outside her apartment was busy, chaotic, and full of noise. But inside, she had created a space where she could be herself. And that, she knew, was all she needed. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across Janice's apartment. She sat by the window, the city's hum soft in the distance. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world felt at peace, as if it had all slowed down for a moment. There were no urgent emails to answer, no collaborations to chase, no pressures from the industry weighing on her shoulders. Just her, the soft glow of the lamp, and the quiet rhythm of her own thoughts. Janice had learned, over the course of this journey, that peace wasn't something you found outside of yourself. It wasn't in the numbers, the recognition, or the endless cycle of success. It was in moments like this, in the stillness, in the simplicity of just being. Her podcast, once a dream that seemed so far out of reach, had become a platform for connection. A place where she shared not just her story, but the stories of countless others. She had gone from the woman who had been ignored in meetings to the woman who had created something of her own. A space where she was in control. But more than that, it was a space where she could be vulnerable, where she could admit that she didn't have all the answers, and where her audience could do the same. Janice reflected on how much had changed in the past year. When she had first started her podcast, she had been filled with a mix of excitement and fear. She had been afraid of being judged, afraid of sharing too much, afraid of being rejected. But over time, she had found her rhythm. She had learned that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. It was what connected her to her audience, what allowed them to see the real her. And in doing so, she had also connected with herself in a deeper way than she ever thought possible. The podcast had brought her opportunities she had once only dreamed of: collaborations, sponsorships, speaking engagements, but it had also brought her something more valuable: the realization that success wasn't about chasing the next big thing. It was about staying true to herself, her purpose, and the impact she wanted to have. It was about creating a space for others to find their voices, just as she had found hers. Janice had been so focused on external validation for so long. She had believed that if she could just get enough followers, enough brand deals, enough recognition, she would finally feel worthy. But now, she knew that the true measure of success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the connections she had made, the lives she had touched, and the authenticity she had maintained throughout it all. As she sat there, a deep sense of gratitude washed over her. She was grateful for every challenge, every setback, every moment of self-doubt, because they had led her to this point. They had shaped her into the person she was becoming, the person who no longer needed external validation to know her worth. She had built something real, something that was hers, and no one could take that away. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. "Hey Janice, I just wanted to check in. I know it's been a busy few weeks, but I've been thinking about your last episode. I loved how you spoke about the importance of authenticity. You've inspired me to take a step back and really reflect on why I'm doing what I'm doing. Thank you for always being real." Janice smiled as she read Rachel's message. It felt good to know that her words had made a difference, that she had inspired someone she deeply respected. Rachel had been one of the few people who had truly understood the challenges of being a content creator, and her support had meant the world to Janice. She typed a quick response, grateful for the friendship they had built through their shared experiences. "I'm glad it resonated with you. I've been doing a lot of reflecting myself. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the hustle, but when I stop and think about what really matters, it's about connection. It's about staying true to why we started in the first place." As she sent the message, Janice realized that the next chapter of her journey wasn't about striving for perfection or chasing the next big opportunity. It was about continuing to speak her truth, to connect with the people who needed to hear her voice, and to create a community where vulnerability and authenticity were valued above all else. For so long, Janice had feared that if she wasn't constantly moving forward, constantly chasing success, she would fall behind. But now, she understood that true fulfillment wasn't about moving faster. It was about being present, about enjoying the journey, and about finding joy in the small moments. She got up from her desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had become her home. The streets below were alive with movement, but up here, in her quiet apartment, everything felt still. It was in moments like these Janice realized that she found clarity. It was in the quiet, in the stillness, that she could hear her own thoughts clearly. Janice thought back to her early days of podcasting, when she had been so unsure of herself, so afraid of putting herself out there. She had wondered if anyone would listen, if anyone would care. But now, as she looked back at everything she had accomplished, she realized that it wasn't the external validation that had mattered. It was the internal growth, the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. The ability to show up, week after week, and be authentic, regardless of the outcome. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from a listener. "Janice, I just wanted to say thank you. Your podcast has changed my life. I've been in a dark place for so long, but listening to your episodes has helped me realize that I'm not alone. You've given me the strength to keep going. I don't know where I'd be without your words." Janice's heart swelled as she read the message. This was why she had started. This was what had kept her going when things felt tough. It wasn't about the numbers or the fame. It was about the difference she was making in people's lives. And in that moment, Janice realized that she had found something far more valuable than success. She had found her purpose. She looked out at the city once more, a sense of peace settling over her. She had come a long way from the woman who had felt invisible, the woman who had been too afraid to speak her truth. Now she was living her truth. She was creating something meaningful, something real. And that was enough. Janice turned away from the window and walked back to her desk, a quiet smile on her face. There was more work to be done, more episodes to record, more stories to tell. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of peace. She was no longer chasing something outside of herself. She was building something that was hers, something that mattered. And that was all she needed. She hit record once more, her voice steady and strong as she spoke into the microphone. If you've ever been dismissed, if you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, don't worry. Quiet strength is still strength. And you are enough. You always have been. As the recording ended, Janice felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She wasn't looking for accolades, for praise, or for recognition. She was simply showing up, week after week, and speaking her truth. And in doing so, she was building a community, one that valued authenticity, vulnerability, and real connection. It was all she had ever wanted.